Presiding Officer. I suspect at the end of my contribution I may be adjudged either iconoclast or heretic. I'm reminded of, on the 23rd of July 1633, Jenny Heriot threw her stool at the minister in St Giles Cathedral at the first use of the Anglican Common Book of Prayer. She sought to overturn the prevailing norms, and I'm going to do something rather similar. I don't think any of this digital stuff matters at all. What actually we really should be debating is communication and services, because that's what we're actually trying to get to. Digital is merely one of a range of ways in which we might support these broader aims. Communication. Let's just talk about communication. The Roman Empire had a series of hilltop signalling posts that enabled a message to get from Londinium to Roma in a mere 6 hours. Didn't work at night, and it didn't work if there was fog or low cloud. But a lot of the time, it meant the pretty good, for 2,000 or so years ago, communication from the outposts of the empire to the centre. And that was one of the reasons why the Roman Empire was so much more successful than the Greek Empire, who was still sending messages around with cleft sticks and a message there. Or alternatively, it was a secret message, shaving the head of the slave, writing the message on there, waiting till the hair grew, and then sending the slave off. It took months. So what we're actually talking about, and we're interested in, is communication. And communication, too, is something that in the digital world has been around a lot longer than we might think. The Scots invented the first fax machine in the 1840s. It was probably analog rather than digital, and the technology we use today is very different. But the telegraph, which was the first real digital communication medium, was the key thing that opened up America. Took communications to the West Coast, made that big country, whose future we will be all watching with interest next week. The first telegraph line between Edinburgh and London was private telegraph line was opened in 1868 when the Bank of Scotland, for whom I worked for 30 years, installed the telegraph line between head office at the Mound and its office in Broad Street in London. The telephone came along a wee bit later in 1882. Like banks everywhere, they were cautious about technology, and the board only approved the telephone on the strict understanding it not be used to conduct business. Computers, too, have been around for quite a long time. There were astrological computers used in Arabia over 1,000 years ago. I will.
Edward Mountain.
I'm always amazed at how much knowledge the member has, and hoping that we're going to move beyond faxes shortly and get to broadband. Could I encourage the member to ask how we're going to get broadband into the remote parts of the Highland to be weaved into his history?
Mr. Stevenson.
We can certainly do that, of course, but I will say in part that the broadband is not necessarily digital. It is actually digital data carried on analog signals. But that's neither here nor there. But it just illustrates why when we talk about digital, we shouldn't get bogged down in all this techie stuff. What we actually want is people to get access to services, access to good communications. Now, I'm disappointed that Mike Rumbles is not here to hear me just mildly correct one or two things. And let me just start by his living next to the trunk road called the A97. Well, that's going to be news to people. There is no trunk road called the A97. The A97 is a local road, the responsibility of the local council. He has been told on umpteen occasions that he is on an exchange on a line, as indeed I am. My exchange is on fibre, I'm not. I'm in the 5%, I'm counted in the 5%. He is counted in the 5%. My brother lives in the centre of Edinburgh. He's on an exchange on a line, he's in the 5%. Different technology will be needed to connect different kinds of people connecting for reasons of history that go back more than 100 years to when the first telephones were installed in Scotland in the late 1870s. And some of that wire's still around. If I've got a wee yes, I will.
Daniel Johnson.
On one hand, I take the member's point that in essence we're not dealing with something new and that it is essentially about communication. However, I think the key difference here is that we're actually facing a change in technology which isn't just about communication, but actually replaces every single step that humans can do in the supply chain across a great broad range of things. And that does need to be addressed and is new in a way that we've never faced before.
Mr. Stevenson.
By the way, I absolutely agree with the member, because the member is absolutely correct. We have been through this in the mechanical era, when we automated the looms, and we saw the huge disruptive effect of that. We are going to see the same disruptive effects here. And I think one of the things, not from that source, one of the things, you wouldn't take mine, I've corrected your problems. But
please
Presiding Officer,
refrain
I will
from
address
having
remarks
conversations with each other. Could you speak through the
I will
chair,
address
please?
my remarks to the chair as I properly should do. I think the big challenge is certainly making sure there's equality of access to the services that we can deliver via the internet. And rural areas at the moment are behind the pace. That's why it's so important by 2021 we get on pace and we are connected. But as we develop these services, we are going to have to look at who gets the rewards for work that is productive. Because a lot of work will be of a social nature, it will be of a cultural nature, because production of goods, the engagement in the delivery of services will employ a lowering proportion of people as time goes on. And that's a fact we'll all have to face, whatever our political views. And we're going to have that debate about the wider effects of changing the way in which we run the modern world. We also have to consider very carefully, and Patrick Harvey touched on it but didn't develop it, homogeneity versus diversity. If we get to a position where there are very few sources of services, a mistake or an error in the implementation of those service deliverers now have much wider effects. The first law of epigenetics says the more highly optimized an organism is for one environment, the more adversely affected by a change in that environment the organism is. The bottom line for this debate is that we need diversity of supply, diversity of delivery. That way we can move forward together, and I'm sure we will do so. I will hope that in future contributions, Mr. Rumbles will take the opportunity to correct the almost totally misleading contribution that he has made today. Presiding Officer.